Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's event, which I'm very excited about. As you can see, we're calling it Censorship, Socialism, and Synagogues, the Rich Legacy of Jewish History South of Union Square. 3 words that I think sum up a good bit, but just the tip of the iceberg of some of the themes of what we see in this neighborhood. And my clicker is not working. I might need a little help with the clicker. For some reason, it doesn't seem to be advancing. It was working well before. Does it need to be turned on, or? There you go. Okay, great. Thanks very much. There we go. Great. Okay. So tonight we're going to talk about Jewish history in the area of Greenwich Village and the East Village south of Union Square. But apropos of this subject, we're going to color outside the lines a little bit and get into some non-Jewish history of this special area, as well as some interesting Jewish history of the surrounding area, if time allows. First, briefly, for those who don't know us, Village Preservation is a nonprofit founded in 1980, and as was said before, we document, celebrate, and preserve the special architectural and cultural heritage of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo. If you want to know more about us or get more involved, the QR code that you see on your screen right now is a great way to do that. It's also on the handouts, so feel free to find out a little bit more about us. So now let's talk about what is this south of Union Square. First of all, roughly it's the area from 5th Avenue to 3rd Avenue, from 14th Street to 9th Street. And as you can see from this map, which is showing designated landmarks or historic districts in the city of New York. It's also an area which, unlike most of its surroundings, is largely lacking in landmark protections. And its zoning encourages the knocking down of existing buildings in many cases and replacing them with office towers, hotels, and luxury condo high-rises. Why should this matter? Well, it's also an it's an area that's extraordinarily rich in diverse 19th and early 20th century architecture. But that beautiful architecture and that distinctive sense of place is rapidly being destroyed with new out-of-scale development, supplanting a generations-long tradition of this area changing and growing through adaptive reuse of historic buildings. Instead, we're seeing unsympathetic and out-of-scale new development like this replacing historic architecture. Yet another recent example. And here's another example, 799 Broadway, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Some of these may be familiar to many of you. We have had a few successes, such as saving these 1866 lofts, which were the home to Willem and Elaine de Kooning. There we go. To Willem and Elaine de Kooning, and a vast constellation of influential 19th century artists from demolition and replacement with a 300-foot tall office tower. So we're currently seeking landmark or historic district designation for this entire area and regularly performing research and creating resources to highlight the area's incredibly rich history and to tell its many stories. Our main way of doing this is via our South of Union Square virtual map and tours, which you can see here, with historic information on all 200 buildings in the area and about 40 themed tours. Much of what you'll see tonight is from that, and you can explore it in full via the QR code here, which is also on the handout. So what makes the neighborhood south of Union Square so distinctive and important? The easiest way to describe the area is as a crossroads between neighborhoods, between types of people and activities, and between movements of history. It's where Greenwich Village and the East Village converge and meet the Manhattan grid north of 14th Street, where residential neighborhoods meet centers of business, where immigrants and captains of industry converged, and where perhaps most importantly, politics, usually of the radical or at least progressive sort, and the arts and commerce became irreversibly intertwined, creating a dynamic tension which made each thread stronger. It's not just where great writers, artists, and musicians lived, but where their works were published, recorded, manufactured, and produced. It's not just where transformative political movements took root, it's where they were led and headquartered. Their largest public demonstrations took place, where they produced missives, lobbied governments, and utilized mass communication to transform the world. It's no exaggeration to say that in these blocks, the center of the art world moved from Paris to New York, that trailblazing political movements were founded and took root, where New York became the center of the publishing industry, and where, quite simply, our culture was produced and changed. And American Jews were very much at the center of all of these, and tonight we'll take a peek at how. So this map shows a little in finer detail our proposed south of Union Square Historic District, which we are working towards, which was ruled eligible for the state and national registers of historic places. But we're still fighting for New York City landmark designation, which is the only way to protect these buildings and that history. So our first stop tonight is going to be in showing many of these intersecting threads and their connections to Jewish history is 80 Fifth Avenue, located at 14th Street, which was the home of the International Workers' Order. The IWO was an insurance, mutual benefit, and fraternal organization founded in 1930 and disbanded in 1954 as a result of legal action undertaken by the state of New York in 1951 on the grounds that the organization was too closely linked to the Communist Party. At its height, in the years immediately following World War II, the IWO reached nearly 200,000 members and provided low-cost health and life insurance, medical and dental clinics, and supported foreign language newspapers, cultural and educational activities. It was notable for being the first such organization to include birth control as part of its health care package, and for its policy of no Jim Crow in the IWO, along with its advocacy against racial discrimination, including in Major League Baseball, which they actually played an important role in effecting, and for combating discrimination against Asian Americans, women, Jews, and other religious and ethnic minorities and immigrants. There we go. The International Workers' Order began as the byproduct of a split of the Workmen's Circle, a Jewish mutual benefit society of social democratic origins. The principal functions of the Workmen's Circle included the provision of unemployment insurance, medical insurance, and life insurance for its members, as well as providing a setting for the discussion of social problems at its meetings. During the factionally charged political climate of the American left in the 1920s, the IWO emerged as a parallel communist fraternal benefit society. The first general secretary of the IWO was Reuben Saltzman, and the first president was William Weiner, both, quote, open and prominent, unquote, members of the Communist Party USA. Now, the membership of the IWO was by no means all communists, but clearly the communists were in the driving seat running the organization in many respects. The IWO described itself in the following manner in its Declaration of Principles. Quote, the IWO provides sick, disability, and death benefits. It organizes for its members medical aid and other forms of fraternal services. It pledges aid and comfort to its members in case of need. The ranks of the IWO and its societies are open to all regardless of sex, nationality, race, color, creed, or political affiliation. The IWO also ran a Jewish summer camp, Camp Kinderland, and the racially integrated Camp Wo Chi Ka. Additionally, the IWO owned and operated cemeteries throughout the USA and Canada, a common practice among left-wing Jewish mutual aid organizations. The IWO was made up of a total of 15 sections, the largest of which was the Jewish section, representing 1/3 of the membership of the IWO, and which in 1944 was renamed the Jewish People's Fraternal Order. When the organization was shut down by the House Un-American Activities Committee and New York State, several of its leaders were branded communists, nearly all of whom were Jews, and the IWO director and naturalized American citizen Sam Milgram, who was the director, was actually deported to the Soviet Union. So as is typical for all of these buildings, which we're going to hit on, there's so many different intersecting themes of history and historic significance here. So in addition to the IWO, a decade or two later, 85th Avenue became the headquarters of the National Gay Task Force, which was the first national gay rights organization in the United States, founded in 1973 and located here from its founding in 1973 to 1985. Its groundbreaking accomplishments included introducing federal anti-discrimination legislation, getting homosexuality removed from the American Medical Association's list of mental illnesses, the first White House meeting with a gay rights group, and spearheading the fight against Anita Bryant and anti-gay initiatives of the 1970s. There was, of course, a Jewish angle here as well, that federal legislation protecting outlawing anti-gay discrimination in employment was introduced by local congresspeople Ed Koch and Bella Abzug, and the organization was founded by, among others, American Jews Frank Kameny, Martin Duberman, and Ron Gold, who are highlighted here. There we go. So next stop on our tour is 75th Avenue at 13th Street. And we're going to talk about Henry Morgenthau Sr. and Near East Relief, which is now known as the Near East Foundation, the oldest non-sectarian international development organization in the United States, and only the second humanitarian organization chartered by Congress. It was founded in New York in September of 1915 in order to initiate relief measures and organize support in response to the unfolding Armenian genocide in the Ottoman Empire. The group's establishment was initiated by Henry Morgenthau Sr., pictured here, the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire between 1913 and 1916. This picture on the left, by the way, is Henry Morgenthau on a Armenian stamp. Peter Balakian, in his book, The Burning Tigris, The Armenian Genocide and the American Response, wrote, quote, Ambassador Morgenthau went beyond the duty of his job as he became the crucial nexus between the killing fields and the American relief community and the press back home. A man of high moral conscience, Ambassador Morgenthau was most likely the first high-ranking diplomat to confront boldly the leaders of the Ottoman government about its treatment of the Armenians. Morgenthau, who was one of the highest-ranking Jewish Americans in the federal government, clearly drew comparisons between the treatment of Jews in Europe and of Armenians and other minorities in the Ottoman Empire. Of the unfolding Armenian genocide, he said, I am firmly convinced that this is the greatest crime of the ages. Morgenthau further said, quote, perhaps the one event in history that most resembles the Armenian deportations was the expulsion of the Jews from Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella. According to Prescott, 160,000 were uprooted from their homes and scattered then, broadcast over Africa and Europe. Yet all these previous persecutions seem almost trivial when we compare them with the suffering of the Armenians, in which at least 600,000 people were destroyed and perhaps as many as 1 million. And in fact, more recent scholarship says the number was probably closer to 1.5 million at least. Morgenthau was one of the first to call out the actions of the Ottomans as an attempt at the systemic elimination of a group of people under the guise of relocation or removal. The marches of Armenians from their homes, quote, represented a new method of massacre, Morgenthau said, a, quote, campaign of race extermination. When the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact. Morgenthau faced surprised resistance to his pleas for sparing the Armenians, based in part upon his being a Jew. Ottoman Interior Minister Talat Pasha asked him, quote, why are you so interested in the Armenians anyway? You were a Jew. These people are Christians. Why can't you let us do with these Christians as we please? The U.S. government, eager to show neutrality in the war, showed little interest in the issue, prompting Morgenthau to resign his post and pursue the cause of saving the Armenians and other minorities in the Ottoman Empire through the founding of the American Committee for Armenian and Syrian Relief. And in fact, the Armenian genocide, which Morgenthau worked so hard to bring to light and stop, would of course not long after serve as the inspiration for Hitler's genocidal plans against the Jews and others. In 1939, as Hitler prepared to invade Poland, he assured his military commanders that they'd get away with it, saying, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Morgenthau had also served as a point of connection between the U.S. government and the concerns of Jewish Americans, including on the issue of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Like many Jews before World War II and the Holocaust, Morgenthau was not a supporter of the Zionist cause. Still, he facilitated conversations about these and other international issues of concern to Jewish Americans. The Near East Relief, which he founded, is credited with saving over 1 million lives, including 130,000 orphans. So, once again, these histories are just the tip of the iceberg of what took place in these buildings. So 75th Avenue, where Morgenthau's Near East Relief was located, was also home to an incredibly broad array, at the same time, of civil rights and social justice organizations, as well as publishers, showing that connection that I mentioned before between politics, commerce, and the arts, as you could also see from those incredible posters that were made in support of their efforts. So among the groups that were located there was the NAACP, which was headquartered here from 1914 to approximately 1925. Now this image actually shows 75th Avenue in the background on the right. This was a decade later when the NAACP moved about a block further north to 15th Street and 5th Avenue to their newer headquarters. But research we've done indicates that they probably first started flying their "A man was lynched yesterday" flag at the 75th Avenue headquarters, which I showed before, which is still standing. The building that this is hanging off of 69 Fifth Avenue was demolished about half a century ago and no longer stands. From here, the NAACP led some of their most important early efforts after their founding in 1909 against lynching, racial discrimination, and voter disenfranchisement, and staged the first civil rights march on Fifth Avenue outside their offices, which is pictured here. I believe this was in maybe 1920. Of course, there's a Jewish angle here as well. The founders of the NAACP included American Jews, Lillian Wald, this is the top row, Henry Moskowitz, and rabbis Emil Gustav Hirsch and Stephen Wise, along with, and this is the bottom row, W.B. Du Bois. Oh, sorry about that. So this was the march. Apologize, and this is the image of the founders I was just describing. And along the bottom row, we have W.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, and Archibald Grimke, who were also among the founders. The Crisis magazine, which was the very first American magazine produced for African Americans, was also located here. And again, as you can see from these images, it's this marriage of the arts, politics, publishing, all of which took place in this area. And this shows our unveiling of a plaque on 75th Avenue from earlier this year. This is one of our victories that we can point to. We did get this building landmarked about a year ago, but it took a long time and we have a long way to go. So next up is a fascinating history. I don't know how many of you know this curious building here at 120 East 12th Street between 3rd and 4th Avenues, a strange vestige of a church that sits in front of NYU's Founders Hall. Returning to our Jewish history, this was the former St. Anne's Church. It was also at one time the home of Temple Emmanuel. The church steeple sitting in front of NYU's Founder Hall on East 12th Street was built in 1847 as part of the 12th Street Baptist Church. So it was originally built in the 1840s as a German Baptist church. However, with the rapidly shifting currents of immigration sweeping through the Lower East Side in the mid-19th century, by 1854, the Baptist Church had ceded the structure to a new occupant, Temple Emmanuel, a small Jewish congregation that previously met on the second floor of a building at Grand and Clinton Streets. They bought the building, formerly a Methodist church, at 56 Christie Street. Actually, just scroll ahead quickly here. So this is the first building that they ever bought, which was their home from 1848 through 1854. Emmanuel was the first Reformed Jewish congregation in New York City, and among the many reforms implemented at the 12th Street building, of which that little piece still stands, to which they moved into in 1854, was allowing men and women to sit together in the pews for the first time. So that was the 56 Christie Street. Okay. It was also in the 12th Street building where Emmanuel introduced instrumental music into religious services, something which had never been done before, filling the halls with a new kind of liturgical prayer experience. Now, this building here, so they arrived there in 1854, but for this rapidly growing congregation, by 1866, Emmanuel had moved out, passing the building onto St. Anne's Catholic Church, which is what it remained from about 1870 until, well, we'll talk about the ending of the story shortly, but until there was no longer a church there. From these humble beginnings, Temple Emmanuel moved to 5th Avenue and 43rd Street in 1868, and that's this building that you see here, this remarkable Moorish landmark. Really an incredible building. It's one of the buildings that gives me pause when I look at it to say, I can't believe people demolished buildings like this. I can't believe this existed and somebody said, we should tear that down and replace that with something else. Here's another image of it. So, and here's another one of these incredible, no longer existent buildings. In 1927, Emmanuel merged with Temple Bethel, which is this congregation's building shown here at 76th Street and Central Park West, and they moved to their current location at 5th Avenue and 65th Street. Yet another incredible building, which it's hard to imagine that people allowed to be demolished. And of course, this is Temple Emmanuel's current home for the last almost 100 years now, 95 years. This last structure is a massive Romanesque revival building, which is often referred to as the largest Reformed synagogue in the world, and by some as the largest synagogue in the world. I can't independently confirm that one way or the other. But back to the issue of demolition. So of course, St. Anne's Church, which interestingly in the course of its lifetime had served as a Protestant church, a Catholic church, and a synagogue, so therefore serving what were the three main faiths of New York City in the late 19th and 20th centuries, which is an incredibly rare feat, was sadly, for the most part, demolished around 2008. And here are images from our historic image archive of the church, both just prior to demolition and during demolition. And this is sadly a poignant illustration of why we need landmark designation for this area, so we do not see more of this taking place. So this is it actually in the process of being demolished to make way for that that NYU dorm, that lovely building that stands there now. So moving on, our next stop is 72 Fifth Avenue, which was built by Moses Ottinger in 1893. This is the corner of 13th Street, just across the street from 75th Avenue, which we were looking at before. Moses' son, Albert, may not be a household name, but he was a person of some renown. He was a member of the New York State Senate and an assistant attorney general, the New York State Attorney General. In 1928, while the Democratic Party nominated Governor Al Smith for the presidency, the first time a Catholic was nominated from a major party running for that office, the Republican Party of New York nominated Ottinger for governor, the first Jewish gubernatorial candidate in New York history. The Democratic Party nominated Franklin D. Roosevelt for governor and Herbert Lehman, also a Jew, as the candidate for lieutenant governor in New York. So you had the first Jewish governor candidate running as a Republican, and on the Democratic ticket you had a Jewish lieutenant governor candidate. On the national ticket, Herbert Hoover won by a landslide over Al Smith, the latter's religion as a Catholic clearly a national issue. It was one of the first times that the Solid South was not quite so solid in voting for a Democrat. The gubernatorial contest, however, was one of the closest in New York history. Against the national Republican trend, Roosevelt won by only 25,000 votes, less than 1% of the 4 million ballots cast. So Ottinger came very, very close to becoming the first Jewish governor of New York. Now we move on to Barney Rossett and Grove Press. I don't know how many people are familiar with his story or the story of Grove Press, but it's really incredible and speaks to so much of what this area is really about. So Grove Press holds a remarkable place in the history of New York and the nation in relation to both the publishing industry and progressive and transformative social and political movements. Grove Press, called the era's most explosive and influential publishing house, and, quote, the most innovative publisher of the post-war era, combines the two, having produced some incredibly important pieces of 20th century literature while working aggressively and effectively to transform American culture in relation to issues of censorship, sexuality, race, and class, among others. Perhaps no person or entity was more responsible for dismantling censorship and restrictions on literature with controversial sexual or political themes in the 20th century than Grove Press and its publisher, Barney Rossett. An astonishing 5 extant buildings in this area, south of Union Square, were home to the Grove Press, its literary magazine, the Evergreen Review, the press's Evergreen Theater, which was purchased to show avant-garde and quote-unquote obscene films, which similarly challenged censorship rules and cultural norms. And a 6th building in the area, 61 4th Avenue, served as Rossett's residence until his death in 2012, as well as the offices of Grove Press and related entities, speaking to this area's singular significance to this incredibly important player in the 20th century culture. In a 2009 interview from his home on that 61 4th Avenue, pictured on the right, just a few years before his death, Rossett said, quote, all of Grove Press's life was within about 4 blocks of here, attesting to his understanding of the integral relationship between this area and all that Grove Press did and accomplished. According to the Stanford University Press, Grove Press and its house journal, the Evergreen Review, revolutionized the publishing industry and radicalized the reading habits of the paperback generation. Grove Press was not only responsible for ending censorship of the printed word in the United States, but also for bringing avant-garde literature, especially drama, into the cultural mainstream as part of the quality paperback revolution. Much of this happened thanks to Rossett, whose charismatic leadership was crucial to Grove's success, saying Grove and Rossett brought to an American audience, quote, world literature and the Latin American boom. Experimental dramas such as the Theater of the Absurd, the Living Theater, and the political epics of Bertolt Brecht. Pornography and obscenity, including the landmark publication of the complete work of the Marquis de Sade. Revolutionary writing featuring Rossett's daring pursuits of the Bolivian journals of Che Guevara, which were all part of the full spectrum of Grove's remarkable achievement as a communications center of the counterculture. Rossett, who was the child of a Jewish father and Irish Catholic mother in Chicago, took over Grove in 1951, 4 years after its founding. He was the first to publish beat poets Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, and Allen Ginsberg, and a who's who of playwrights including Tom Stoppard and Harold Pinter, political biographies like Alex Haley's The Autobiography of Malcolm X, erotic literature like The Story of O, groundbreaking gay fiction by Jean Genet, and banned classics such as Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer and D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover. Here he is painting a mural on his loft, which he literally spent years working on right up to the point of his passing. Among the Jewish authors who he published were Jacqueline Suzanne, Norman Mailer, Allen Ginsberg, and Tom Stoppard, who were integral parts of the Grove Press stable. And again, just in case you think that any of these buildings are significant for just one reason, 61 4th Avenue, where Rossett lived until his death, was also the home of artist Robert Indiana and Robert Motherwell before Rossett had moved in. Similarly, 80 University Place, which was one of the buildings that we showed, which had been one of the places where Grove Press had been located in the 1960s, certainly had some significance beyond Barney Rossett and Grove Press. It was the offices of the Village Voice, which, among other things, saved Greenwich Village by rallying against Robert Moses, helped vanquish Tammany Hall, exposed political corruption, elevated the feminist movement, exposed the city's worst landlords, and covered racial violence and discrimination in a way few other papers would. Little known, it also led the successful crusade to require cleaning up after your dogs, resulting in the pooper scooper legislation that was passed in the 1970s, I believe. The Village Voice was, of course, founded by American Jews, including Norman Mailer, Dan Wolfe, and Ed Fancher. That building also happened to be, in the 19th century, the home of Elizabeth Blackwell, the very first female doctor in America. She not only lived there, but she had her offices there, where she practiced medicine and dramatically transformed public health, not just in New York, but in the country. So our next stop on the tour is to 55 Fifth Avenue, which is at 12th Street. This building has a remarkable history as the home to both one of the most significant musical recording studios of the early 20th century, where some of the first integrated musical recordings ever took place, and Billie Holiday's very first recording, and one of the great publishing houses of that era as well. And bringing it back to the Jewish angle, among the great musicians who recorded here were Benny Goodman, who in fact was involved with some of those earliest integrated musical recordings. And this is where W.W. Norton was located, which is the largest employee-owned publishing house in the world, which, among other impressive tomes, published The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Okay, moving a little bit further east, we have photographer Helen Levitt at 4 and 6 East 12th Street, so just east of Fifth Avenue. Levitt was a visual poet laureate of the life in the streets of New York City. She and her wondrous photographs captured the playful dance of urban life. Her favorite subjects were the people she encountered in her neighborhood streets. Given the unique characteristics of her subjects, it's no surprise that she lived and photographed most of the years of her life right here in our neighborhoods. She lived in a 4th floor walk-up at the row house at 4 to 6 East 12th Street, just east of Fifth Avenue, for over 40 years until her death at the age of 95. Born in 1913 in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, to Jewish parents, Helen Levitt became intrigued with the transitory chalk drawings that were part of the New York children's street culture of the time, while she was teaching art classes to children in the mid-1930s. She purchased a Leica camera and began to photograph these chalk drawings, as well as the children who made them. Her depiction of street life blended the poetic and the political. She said, quote, "I decided I should take pictures of working class people and contribute to the movements, whatever movements there were, socialism, communism, whatever was happening." She said she saw the pictures of great male photographers of her time and realized that photography could be an art, and that made her ambitious. She was repaid with many of her inspirations paying tribute to her. One of the most prominent female photographers of the time, in 1939, her works were included in the inaugural exhibition of the Museum of Modern Art's photography department, where her 1939 image of children trick-or-treating received especially high praise. Okay. Now we have 6466 Fifth Avenue. This 8-story commercial loft building between 12th and 13th Street was built in 3 stages. In 1892 by architect R.H. Robertson, with additions in 1907 and 1915. It was built as the first American headquarters of the prestigious Macmillan Company publishing house, later housing Frederick A. Prager Publishers, as well as the first art cinema house in America and the first studio of Picasso of dance, Martha Graham. Bringing it back to the Jewish angle, working with Graham here at this location was Anna Sokolow, often referred to as, quote, the rebellious spirit of modern dance, who had an enormous impact on the field and is credited with helping to bring modern dance to Mexico and Israel. Sokolow was one of the most important creatives involved in the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. She was a dancer who used her talent, connection, and understanding of the movement of workers' empowerment, of the movement for workers' empowerment, to connect to people involved in the labor movement, especially the Garment Workers Union. Sokolow was the daughter of Russian Jewish immigrants, and the Jewish community was among Sokolow's first audiences. Russian Jewish culture remained a central inspiration throughout her career, in which she created pieces inspired by Orthodox Jewish wedding ceremonies, the Old Testament, and Emma Lazarus poems, and addressed issues like the Nazi persecution of Jews. Sokolow directed synagogue services combining poetry and dance. She spent a good deal of time performing in Israel, where she worked closely with a Yemenite dance company. Next, we have 35 East 12th Street. This 1896 building housed the Morning Freiheit. Freiheit, or Freedom, was a Yiddish daily communist paper founded in 1922. Paul Novick was the first news editor and had been editor-in-chief from 1939 until it ceased publication in 1988. In a final editorial, Novick said the paper was dedicated to, quote, fighting for a better life for the workers in the factories and shops and a better lifestyle, a newspaper for fostering of Yiddish culture and Yiddish cultural institutions and organizations. He also said the Freiheit was a militant workers' and people's newspaper alongside the Communist Party membership, and the paper was notable for its commitment to ending racism in America. In 1956, when Nikita Khrushchev disclosed Stalin's crimes, the Daily began increasingly challenging Soviet policy, accusing the Kremlin of habitual anti-Semitism and deploring its intervention in Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan. As a result, the American Communist Party expelled Mr. Novick in 1972 after more than 50 years' membership, accusing him of openly serving, quote, United States imperialism and, quote, Jewish nationalism and Zionism. In reply, he affirmed his backing for democratic socialism and for the Soviet Union, quote, the way it was during the Lenin period when Jewish culture flourished. We are, Novick said, for détente and cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Freiheit was one of the most prominent Yiddish newspapers published in the United States and the showcase of left-wing socialist artists and writers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, Zionist and internationalist. The newspaper made political contributions related to the formation of the International Fur and Leather Workers Union, as well as many of the needle and trade unions in the United States, including the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the CIO. Went one too far. Starting in the late 1920s, the building also housed the headquarters for the Communist Party of the United States, the office of Earl Browder, the party's general secretary and a presidential candidate, the plant of the Daily Worker, the official communist daily paper, and the Communist Workers Bookshop and Worker School, the Young Communist League, and finally, last but not least, the National Negro Congress. On June 20th, 1940, the offices of the Communist Party here and of the German consulate, located a little bit further downtown, were bombed within an hour of each other, making national headlines. So, moving from the communist sphere, a little bit more into the mainstream. Here at 45 University Place, which is located between 9th and 10th Street, we have the Social Reform Club, which boasted a membership featuring the city's most renowned reform leaders, attempting to confront the most pressing issues facing working people locally and internationally. The Social Reform Club was formally organized in 1894 to cultivate consciousness about and organize around the improvement of industrial and social conditions. As a critical part of its mission, it sought to unite working people with their allies. American Jews who were among the leaders of the organization included the Ethical Culture Society founder Felix Adler, labor union leader Samuel Gompers, shown here, and nurse, humanitarian, and author Lillian Wald. According to Gomper's published papers, the group required that half of the members be wage earners. So in other words, they tried very hard to make sure that this was not just the well-to-do saying, you know, we want to make a better world. They wanted to actually have workers as part of the organization. In addition to hosting classes, lectures, and conferences documented widely in newspapers of the time, the club coordinated nonpartisan support of legislation. Continuing in the Gompers theme, just a block or two further east, we have Webster Hall at 125 East 11th Street. This 1887 building was a center of leftist, anarchist, and union political activity and a gathering place for the city's working class, whether it was for union rallies or evening entertainment. In 1888, the Brooklyn Eagle described Webster Hall as, quote, a big, bare, dingy place where all the year-round discontented men meet to discuss their wrongs and sympathize with one another, and where secret societies and political organizations, labor unions, and similar associations make a business of pleasure. It is a grimy neighborhood where the rattle of trade continues all day and leaves poverty to toss itself to sleep at nightfall. Not the most flattering description. The hall hosted notable figures including labor leader Samuel Gompers, who came for a meeting of striking brewery workers in 1888, as well as social activists like Emma Goldman, Margaret Sanger, and Dorothy Day. The Progressive Labor Party was formed here in 1887, and the founding convention of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union of America took place here in 1914. In 1913, the Greenwich Village-based socialist magazine The Masses held a fundraiser at this location, sparking Webster Hall's next era, in which it became known for its masquerade balls. These events attracted a bohemian crowd throughout the Prohibition period. This is also one of the few good stories of our landmarking efforts. We got this building landmarked in 2008, so it, at least, is safe. Of course, Emma Goldman lived just around the corner, just outside of this area, at 208 East 13th Street, which is just east of 3rd Avenue. This is going to seem like a sort of odd departure. One of the tours that we have on our South of Union Square guide is popular culture. We try to find different ways of engaging people. So one of the interesting things about this area, that post office, the Cooper Station post office, is where Newman is supposed to have worked on Seinfeld. And of course, 4951 Fifth Avenue, also in this area, were the home of Paul and Jamie Buckman on Mad About You. So a little Jewish popular cultural history there. And speaking of 4951 Fifth Avenue, was also the home, actually at the top floor, of Jewish American artist Jane Freilicher, who frequently painted many of her most evocative paintings from her perch there on Fifth Avenue and 12th Street. And again, you know, none of these places are have just one reason for their significance. 51 Fifth Avenue, when it first opened, was also the home of the previously mentioned Al Smith, the first Catholic major party candidate for president. After he lost that election in 1928, he retired from elected politics and moved here, where he spearheaded the effort to get the Empire State Building built, which he did in record time, in just about a year. And there he is. Oh. There he is, sorry about that, on the upper right at the opening of the Empire State Building in 1931. So next up, we have 112 4th Avenue, which was the home of the Progressive Zionist League and Hashomer Hatzer. So this is a cast iron loft building just south of 12th Street, constructed in 1872. The Hashomer Hatzer was a labor Zionist, secular Jewish youth movement founded in 1913 in Austria-Hungary. In 1946, graduates of the Hashomer Hatzer in the United States established an organization called the Progressive Zionist League, which was located here. Its aim was the creation of a political public framework that would impact the American reality and influence the establishment of the Jewish state in the spirit of the values of the Hashomer Hatzer. Its publications included a socialist analysis, I should say, and critiques of Israeli politics, discussions of the kibbutz movement, hopeful attitude regarding integration of Arab citizens, resistance to the adoption of a state and resistance to the adoption of a state religion. After several organizational evolutions and mergers, the League is today known as Partners for Progressive Israel, which advocates for peace between Israel and its neighbors, an independent Palestinian state, and a more just and equitable society in Israel, particularly through the engagement of American Jews. And that's just, again, the sort of the tip of the iceberg of the history connected to this building. It was also the home of the New York Daily Call, which was one of the most prominent socialist newspapers in New York. And they were also home to, this was sort of interesting, a publishing house called the Academy Press, who produced some really, really interesting books. This one here was published in 1923, and it was called The Real Chinese in America by J.S. Tao, the Secretary of the Chinese Consulate General of New York. Through this publication, Tao sought to confront and combat the widespread prejudice and discrimination experienced by Chinese Americans. You may not know this, but by law, Chinese Americans could not become citizens, could not vote, etc. in America until during World War II, when they were allies in the war, and we sort of had to change that very, very blatantly discriminatory law. Another interesting publication which came out of the Academy Press was this one called The Triumphant Plutocracy, The Story of American Public Life from 1870 to 1920, which was written by South Dakota's first senator, Robert Pettigrew, pictured here. The book was a searing indictment of the American political system by the iconoclastic and somewhat quixotic lawyer, surveyor, and land developer turned senator who was indicted under the Espionage Act during World War I for encouraging young men to resist the draft. Pettigrew was a fierce critic of American imperialism and the United States takeover of Hawaii and the Philippines against the will of the residents of those islands. Some notable quotes from this book include, quote, "Capital is stolen labor and its only function is to steal more labor. Under the ethics of his profession, the lawyer is the only man who can take a bribe and call it a fee." Of the Republican Party, which he left, he said, quote, "It had come into being as a protest against slavery and as the special champion of the Declaration of Independence. It would go out of being and out of power as the champion of slavery and as the repudiator of the Declaration of Independence." And this he said 100 years ago or more. He also said, "The Russian Revolution is the greatest event of our times. It marks the beginning of the epoch when the working people will assume the task of directing and controlling industry. It blazes a path into this unknown country where the workers of the world are destined to take from their exploiters the right to control and to direct the economic affairs of the community." So as you can see, there was a lot of very a lot of things getting published here that probably would not have been published other places. But that was very much the nature of this area. So a few more stops within south of Union Square, again, for some what I think are particularly interesting characters. Here at 102 4th Avenue in this early 19th century row house lived photographer Aaron Siskind, who was a neighbor of the Lower East Side. He graduated from City College in 1926 and taught in the New York City public school system between 1926 and 1949. He first rose to prominence in the 1930s as a member of the socially conscious New York Photo League, for which he created his celebrated photo series called Harlem Document, which has been called one of the most important visual records of Harlem during the Great Depression, which contained many photos which actually were not even published until 1981. It was a moving series of portraits as well as scenes of street life and home life in Harlem from 1932 to 1940, part of the larger project initiated by the Photo League to examine urban neighborhoods, which was funded in part by the Federal Writers Project. Siskind lived here for many, many, many years, and his work focused on both places like Harlem, and he and others in the League did work connected with the Catholic worker movement and documenting life on the Bowery as well. So one of our last stops on the tour is 59 4th Avenue. Remember to forward it over there as well. And we're going to talk about the book, Henry Roth's book, Call It Sleep. This 8-story white brick and stone neoclassical building was constructed in 1897. By the way, the building that you see just to the left of it is 61 4th Avenue, which was the Barney Rossett residence we were talking about before. This 8-story white brick and stone neoclassical building was constructed in 1897. Henry Roth wrote his novel, Call It Sleep, in 1934, based on his own experience as a young Jewish immigrant child living on the Lower East Side. To this day, it is touted as a classic and one of the best depictions of the Jewish immigrant experience on the Lower East Side. It centers on a boy named David Sherrill, who came to America with his mother from Galicia, meeting up with his abusive father who had immigrated earlier. The story is told through David's eyes and winds through the troubled home life of the boy and the often brutal experiences of living on the Lower East Side during the early 20th century. Although the novel met with positive reviews at the time, it did not sell well, and both the book and Roth dropped into obscurity for the next few decades. A few critics continued to maintain its significance through that time, and in 1960, a small publisher located at 59 4th Avenue, Pageant Books, which is also a secondhand bookstore of the same name, which some of you may know, republished it, dramatically changing the fortunes for both Roth and the novel. Call It Sleep was then subsequently published in paperback by Avon in 1964, and in that same year, New York Times book critic Irving Howe reviewed it and proclaimed it to be, quote, one of the few genuinely distinguished novels written by a 20th century American. It would go on to sell 1 million copies, and its republication and subsequent popularity would inspire Roth to write and publish again. Before, we briefly touched on this building, 799 Broadway, the former St. Denis Hotel, is one of the unfortunate losses in this neighborhood. We could have a whole 1-hour lecture or more on the history of this building, but I'll mention that two of the interesting characters connected to Jewish history here were the actress Sarah Bernhardt, who had stayed here. This was her favorite place to stay in New York in the 19th century. And then on the right, we have Shulamith Firestone, who was one of the founders of New York Radical Women, which was located here at 799 Broadway, who did a lot of things, but one of the things they were most famous for was that demonstration against the Miss America pageant in 1968, I believe, in Atlantic City, which is pictured over here, and you can see their publication over there with the 799 Broadway address connected to it. Marcel Duchamp also happened to have lived and had studios in this building, again showing that the levels of significance here are almost limitless. So that's the end of the strictly south of Union Square stuff that I want to show you, but I want to briefly hit on a couple of other things because, of course, our neighborhoods are vastly extensive and there's some really interesting Jewish history outside of there, and as you'll see on the handout that we gave you, we have some other tools that will allow you to explore it further. So, for instance, of course, in Greenwich Village, just literally feet outside the area that we're talking about, is the residence of Emma Lazarus, who wrote The Great Colossus, which the poem which appears on the Statue of Liberty. This is a particularly amazing story if you don't know it. Also, just a little bit outside this area, on 11th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, is the second cemetery of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue of Sharif, Israel. So I didn't know. I always knew this was an old Jewish cemetery on 11th Street, a weird triangular shape, you know. People had been buried there a very long time ago. What I didn't realize was, first of all, this is the very first Jewish congregation in North America who arrived here, Sephardic Jews, in 1654, escaping the Inquisition in what had been Dutch Brazil when the Portuguese took over. So this is the beginning of Jewish life in North America, which is, of course, now, along with Israel, the two centers of Jewish population in the world today. So when the congregation was first founded, it was located, like everything else in New York, in the lower tip of Manhattan, and its very first cemetery was destroyed, no longer exists. When it was destroyed, some of the bodies were moved to what's called the First Cemetery, which does still exist down in Chinatown, sort of just a little bit north of the police headquarters, and they moved some of the bodies to there. If you know that building, it's on, not that building, that cemetery, it's on St. James Place. It's also of a strange shape. It's funny, the story of the cemetery is almost like the story of Jews and the diaspora. They kept getting pushed out of places. So the first cemetery was destroyed, so they had to move a little bit further north. That cemetery was partly destroyed because they built a street that went through it, which is why it's the funny shape that it is, and they moved some of the bodies from that first cemetery to this second cemetery on 11th Street. So it's possible that some of those first settlers, the first Jews to come to North America, their remains may be in the cemetery. If they were moved from the very first one, which no longer exists, the Zero Cemetery, to the first, and then from the first to the second. So the second was also partially destroyed when the street grid was created. That's why it's this strange triangular shape. And some of those bodies were also moved from there to what's now called the Third Cemetery, which still exists intact on 20th Street in Chelsea, not too far from here. And for those of you who don't know, the Sharif Israel is still a congregation, still around on Central Park West and 70th Street. They're actually they're doing a renovation of the building, of the cemetery, I'm sorry, right now, which is great. So let me just move a little bit further. These two buildings, iconic Greenwich Village buildings, the one on the right, the Harmon Hendricks house, Isaac Hendricks house, built in 1799, the oldest house in Greenwich Village, and just next to it, 75.5 Bedford Street, the later from the 1870s, but the narrowest house in New York City, were both built by descendants of those first Sephardic Jewish settlers of New York, which I also did not know, so some interesting Jewish history there as well. The home of Hank Greenberg over there on Barrow Street, which has that wonderful plaque there memorializing it. Some great authors. Again, this is all from the resources that we have on our website, so I urge you to explore it further. Looking over to the East Village, there's one particularly fascinating building there that I want to just briefly talk about before I wrap up, and that is this building here. All of these buildings, which are on the corner of Stuyvesant Street and 9th Street, were part of what was the Hebrew Technical Institute, which was founded in 1884. And by the way, this is also just literally feet outside of what we call south of Union Square, since it's just east of 3rd Avenue. Founded in 1884, and it was in operation here at this location at Stuyvesant and 9th Street until it closed in 1939. It was called by the New York Evening Post, quote, the first manual training school of a public nature in New York. Housed in a complex of buildings located around the triangular intersection of 9th and Stuyvesant Street, it was the site of life-changing education for children and adults of all religions, nationalities, and backgrounds. 225 East 9th Street, the oldest of the buildings, was originally built in 1891 for the Baron de Hirsch Trade School, a charitable organization established in the 19th century to help poor Jews from Eastern Europe escape poverty and violence and settle in the New World. Sometime between 1899 and 1901, the Hebrew Technical Institute took over 225 East 9th Street and built 34 Stuyvesant Street as an addition to it. Those are the two buildings on the top of your screen. There's some interesting, the main building, this is what it looked like in the 19th century. The look that it has today dates to around 1914, but there's some interesting background history to this building before it was the Hebrew Technical Institute, which in and of itself was just amazingly trailblazing in terms of what it did. So this building was home to the Young Men's Woman Suffrage League in the 1870s, which was not only one of the very first formal organizations established to promote women's suffrage. It was, we believe, the very first men's organization established to promote women's suffrage. And they regularly met here, and while they did not last very long, their leader went on to do a tremendous amount of work around the issue of both women's suffrage and African American suffrage. The building was built by James Plimpton, who also happened to be the inventor of the modern roller skate. And this building had one of the first roller skating rinks in New York. In the late 19th century, roller skating, after Plimpton invented this new version of the roller skate, which is the roller skate that we really know now, that has these sort of fixed wheels connected to it, it became the sort of the thing to do. Everybody in high society wanted a sort of roller skate. And so in the 1860s, he built this roller skating rink in this building, which eventually became the Hebrew Technical Institute many years later. But with the Panic of 1873, roller skating went out of fashion, and he turned it into a hall for hire. And as that hall for hire, that's when the Young Men's Suffrage League turned this building into its home. So again, just this incredible multiple layers of history that you see in these neighborhoods. And I'm going to wrap up now because I'm aiming for an hour and we're hitting the 1 hour mark. But, I hope that this intrigues you and you want to explore even further, and the materials that you may have picked up on the way in, or hopefully, if not, will on the way out, will give you an opportunity to find out the stories of so many more buildings, people, places, events like this. These are just some of the other ones. Levi Strauss, I don't know if you knew that Levi Strauss was from the Lower East Side, a Jewish immigrant. He got his start here before moving out west. We have a tour on our East Village website about the Yiddish Rialto, which was centered on 2nd Avenue. This building here on 4th Street between the Bowery and 2nd Avenue is where Yiddish theater in America was born, very much still stands. So again, the QR code is there for you to explore further. And that is the end of my presentation, and I am happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you very much for listening. And I think Leanne is going to.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I thought the information and the details that you gave were absolutely fascinating. And if I may be rude, I found that the information was more fascinating than the buildings. So therefore, may I make this ridiculous suggestion that your organization focus on the creation of a museum in one building, which may have many floors, where this information is categorized and available to the public, because much of that information is unknown.
Sure.
And it would celebrate the Jewish contribution to culture in not only New York, but in the United States.
Sure.
So thank you for your presentation, but it was invaluable information.
Well, I very much appreciate that, and that's really what these online resources are. Someday, maybe, it's a day that is probably far off. Someday we may have a brick and mortar place like the Center for Jewish History does, where we have exhibitions and things like that. We don't have that currently, but in the virtual sphere, we have exactly what you're referring to. So if you go to our South of Union Square tour, you can go on the Jewish History tour. It will show you everything that I showed you and more with greater detail. You can go into as much detail as you want, less detail, all of those other sort of related things. It's all there. So we work very hard to create these kinds of resources to get that information out there, make it available to folks, maybe someday in the sort of bricks and mortar form that you described, but certainly right now in that virtual format as well.
So when are those tours available?
They're available right now. Just scan that QR code, it'll take you right to it. Yeah. Right.
How did it come to be that so many progressive organizations were located at 85th Avenue, was it a sympathetic landlord?
I think you mean 75th Avenue, but yes, it was a sympathetic landlord. I believe his name was George Plimpton. He built the building, and he was very interested in having educational organizations, human rights organizations, things of that nature located there. And then once they started locating there, I mean, we could have a whole lecture about it, about the interaction between the various groups there. You know, Morgenthau was convinced to do what he did based on some of the conversations that he had with some of the leaders of some of the other organizations that were located in this building. So it was really this incredible exchange of progressive thought, organizing, et cetera, and again, using these means of politics, publishing, the arts, et cetera, and each one kind of germinating the other ones all in this one place. It's rare that you have such a beehive of activity like that all in one place, and a sympathetic landlord is almost always a necessity for something like that. Great.
Thank you so much for the presentation. A lot of really fascinating information, fascinating history. I was wondering throughout the presentation, I guess sort of separate from the history itself, more in terms of like how we're preserving this history. Obviously, like your organization, its strategy, its approach to preserving the history is the historic designation of the buildings. And I'm just wondering how you guys think about that, how you guys square that with the housing shortage in our city, and the role that restrictive zoning plays in creating that housing shortage.
Sure. Well, two things. One is, landmarking is one of the ways in which we do it. It's not the only one. Obviously, we spend an incredible amount of time of documenting this. In regard to your second question, we could have a whole other conversation and program about that. You and I might, I'm guessing we might disagree about the sort of the impact of restrictive zoning and things like landmarking. From our experience, we actually see that unrestricted development tends to have the effect of pushing out lower income residents. Oftentimes new development, we see buildings that are 5 times the size of the building that they replaced, but actually have less units of housing than the building that was originally there. So I don't want to not do justice to what is a very serious question by, in a sort of very simplistic way, kind of dismissing it. But I will say that it's an issue we grapple with and think about all the time. And, one of the amazing virtues of this area has been that over the years there has been this incredible adaptive reuse of buildings, which, by the way, is the sort of greenest, most environmentally sound way of doing development. And so many of these buildings have been converted to housing, which is great. We would love to work with the city to find ways of continuing that trend and doing it in ways that includes affordable housing, which is absolutely not getting built in this area now. We've actually proposed various zoning plans that would either require or incentivize the construction of affordable housing in the neighborhood, and we've never gotten a receptive response from City Hall so far. Maybe that'll change, but we'll keep trying. So, yes.
Keeping the facade of the church in front of the NYU dorms, what was the reason for that? Was it just like NYU just keeping that for themselves, or was it
So
landmark?
this is a, it was not landmark. This is a classic NYU story. So we were very much involved in the fight to try to protect that church and keep it from being demolished. Did I pass it? No, I think it's further up. And of course, we were unable, here we go, we're unable to convince NYU and the developer to save the building or to build the building in such a way that the church remained and that they built around it. So at the end of the day, what they said, and I don't know if they thought this was going to make somebody happy or what, they said, we'll keep the tower, we're going to demolish everything else. So basically there's going to be this empty, unoccupiable, it almost looks like a sort of stuffed mounted, like you killed a deer or something, and like you put it on your wall in front of the building. Now, this was not our intention or design. We wanted the the church, the building, or as much of it as possible to be saved. I have to say, I'm really, really glad that we at least got this and that it's not entirely gone. And I'll tell you why. You can't walk down that street and not see that and say, what the hell happened here? What's behind this story? What used to be here? Now, you might not immediately know what it is. If you go to our website or some other places, you can find out the story. But if nothing else, there is something here that says something happened here, something crazy, something disastrous. And there used to be something very different here than what is there now. That was not NYU's intention by any means, I think, in doing this, but I'm glad that it's a perhaps unintended byproduct of what was a very awkward compromise in the end. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if not, I understand there's a reception outside, and everybody would have a chance, if you haven't already, to explore the center's wonderful display of Union Square history. I want to thank everybody from the center and all of you for turning out tonight, and I do hope you explore this history even further with those resources that we have available for you. So thank you very much.